If full direction obstacle avoidance used to be something that only belonged to high-end flagship drones, then Neo 2 is an interesting moment for DJI, because on the surface it looks like DJI is finally pushing omnidirectional obstacle sensing down to much lower tiers. Something that, until recently, was reserved for expensive drones with heavy sensor stacks. But if you pause for a second and really think about it, there's an immediate question that comes up. If Neo 2 is using fewer cameras, fewer sensors, and a much simpler hardware layout, yet still claims near full coverage obstacle avoidance, then the system clearly has to work very differently from what we're used to. So instead of focusing on marketing claims, I want to look at Neo 2 from a more practical angle. How this obstacle avoidance system actually works, what DJI did to make it possible at this size and price, and what compromises come with that decision. To understand Neo 2, it helps to quickly look at how DJI's obstacle avoidance systems evolved. Early full direction systems relied on multiple fisheye cameras and worked mostly in good daylight. Low light performance was limited and reliability dropped quickly once conditions weren't ideal. Later, DJI improved sensor sensitivity, noise reduction, and eventually added LiDAR as a safety layer, especially to keep obstacle avoidance working at night. Then we reached drones like the Mavic 4 Pro with 3 sensors on top and 3 on the bottom, combined with very high low light sensitivity. That setup pushed perception accuracy to a much higher level, but it also came with cost, size, and weight penalties. So when DJI now introduces a simplified LiDAR-assisted solution, it's clearly a strategic move. Omnidirectional obstacle avoidance has become a feature people expect to see, even on smaller drones, and Neo 2 represents the lightest, most cost-controlled version of that idea so far. Naturally, that also means trade-offs. When you first look at Neo 2's sensor layout, the most obvious question is a technical one. How do 2 fisheye cameras placed vertically on the body actually create obstacle avoidance? They're not a binocular pair. There's no traditional left-right stereo baseline. The answer lies in a clever workaround. Instead of relying on 2 cameras seeing the same scene at the same time, Neo 2 relies on motion. The drone uses its IMU to measure how far it moves, then compares how the image changes before and after that movement. In simple terms, one camera observes the same scene twice, from 2 slightly different positions. By combining the distance the drone moved with the change in image perspective, the system reconstructs depth using displacement-based stereo. It's not true binocular vision, but functionally it can produce a similar depth estimate. This design choice explains a lot about how Neo 2 behaves in real flight. It also immediately reveals one of its biggest limitations. If the drone is hovering in place or rotating on the spot, it can't generate new depth information from vision alone. No movement means no displacement, and no displacement means no new depth data. You can see this very clearly in practice. If Neo 2 is hovering and you walk around it, only the front sector reacts in real time, roughly the area covered by the LiDAR. In every other direction, there's no immediate obstacle response, and that leads to another unusual behavior. When Neo 2 rotates, obstacle warnings don't disappear right away. That's because they're not being recalculated using live depth data, but instead reconstructed using compass and gyroscope information. So if the system generates a false detection and the drone doesn't move, that warning can simply stay there. Higher-end drones using real binocular vision can also false trigger sometimes, but those errors usually disappear very quickly. With Neo 2, in some situations, the only way to clear a false warning is to force the drone to move so the system can re-measure distance. This becomes even more noticeable once we look at how Neo 2 behaves at night and how LiDAR fits into the system, which is where things start to get more interesting. Once you start flying Neo 2 in low light or night conditions, the role of LiDAR becomes much clearer, because while the vision system depends heavily on movement to reconstruct depth, LiDAR does not. As long as the LiDAR can detect an object, it can provide distance information even when the drone isn't translating very much. That's why Neo 2 is still able to offer obstacle avoidance at night, despite using a simplified visual system. Just like on Mini 5 Pro, Once the LiDAR detects an obstacle, that information is stored temporarily in a spatial model. Rotating the drone doesn't immediately clear the warning because the system assumes the obstacle is still present in space. From a safety perspective, this makes sense. But it also means that if LiDAR generates a false detection, that warning can persist longer than you might expect. Neo2 offers two manual obstacle avoidance behaviors, brake and bypass. Brake mode is straightforward. As the drone approaches an obstacle, it gradually slows down and then stops. Bypass mode is more interesting, and it's where Neo2 starts to feel very different from DJI's higher-end drones. Bypass comes in standard and aggressive modes, but both share the same underlying logic. On drones like Mini 5 Pro, obstacle avoidance is very conservative. Even if an obstacle isn't directly in your flight path, the drone will often slow down preemptively just to be safe. Neo2 doesn't behave like that. And if the system decides that an obstacle doesn't require a significant detour, Neo2 simply maintains its current speed. Flying at 4 meters per second, it stays at 4, 6 meters per second stays 6. Even at 8 meters per second, Neo2 will often hold speed until a real avoidance maneuver is required. This difference is immediately noticeable if you're used to DJI's more cautious avoidance behavior. When Neo2 does need to make a larger detour, it will start reducing speed. Interestingly, the amount of speed reduction is quite similar regardless of how fast you were flying to begin with. 8 meters per second drops to around 6, 6 drops to around 4. What's important here is that even after slowing down, the final speed is still higher than the range where obstacle detection is most precise, which is roughly 2.5 to 3 meters per second. That means Neo2 is often avoiding obstacles at speeds where its sensing accuracy is already compromised. It works, but it's clearly operating closer to the edge. Things get even more complicated once you look at sideways and backward flight. In dense environments like forests, Neo2 often responds by climbing upward automatically. At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. Staying low usually means dealing with tree trunks, which are relatively easy to detect. Climbing higher introduces branches, leaves, and thinner obstacles that are much harder to sense. But this behavior starts to make more sense once you consider Neo2's physical design, because Neo2 has a full protective cage around the propellers. It can afford to be less cautious. Collisions that would be serious on other drones often result in little more than a bump here. That physical protection hides a lot of sensing limitations that would be unacceptable on a more fragile aircraft. This is also where blind zones become more obvious. The blind areas tend to sit around the upper and lower edges of the drone's body plane, and they shift as the drone tilts. Even upward avoidance, despite having sensors, is limited by how this system reconstructs depth. You might still see occasional moments where Neo2 drifts into branches or shrubs that simply weren't detected in time. Fortunately, most of those moments end without serious consequences, again, thanks to the protective cage. At this point, it's clear that Neo2's obstacle avoidance system is not designed to be perfect. It's designed to be good enough, paired with a physical design that can survive mistakes. But to really understand where the system draws the line, we need to look more closely at LiDAR itself, especially its strengths and its weaknesses with smaller objects. One thing that becomes very clear once you push Neo2 a bit harder is that LiDAR is reliable at stopping the drone, but not always reliable at detecting everything. For larger, well-defined objects, LiDAR works well, whether you're flying at 4, 6, or even 8 meters per second. Once the system detects an obstacle, braking is decisive and consistent. But when you start dealing with thinner objects, small poles, narrow branches, or wires, detection becomes much less reliable. Even at lower speeds, those objects can still slip through the sensing net. So in practice, and it makes sense to treat LiDAR as something you can trust to stop the drone after detection, but not something you should blindly trust to detect every obstacle in the first place. This becomes particularly relevant during return-to-home scenarios. For large structures like buildings, Neo2 generally behaves conservatively. It starts climbing early, and the climb profile is biased toward safety rather than efficiency. However, small details like antennas, lightning rods, or thin structures on rooftops are still a weak point. Neither the fisheye cameras nor LiDAR handle those especially well. Because of that, despite having obstacle avoidance, manual return to home is often still the safer choice in complex environments. Automation helps, but it doesn't replace awareness. While of course another major feature DJI highlights on Neo2 is full area flight. Unlike higher-end drones, Neo2 doesn't use stereo downward vision or a full three-dimensional infrared sensor. Instead, it relies on a combination of a single infrared emitter, a single infrared receiver, and a fisheye camera. If you cover the infrared receiver, the drone loses accurate distance measurement to the ground. If you cover the fisheye camera, features like palm landing stop working. Interestingly, nighttime hovering stability on Neo2 is still much better than on Neo1, but this improvement doesn't come from vision, it comes from more stable and more accurate GNSS positioning. Based on how this system behaves, it's reasonable to expect that this kind of hybrid setup will become the standard approach for entry-level drones going forward. It delivers acceptable performance at a much lower hardware cost. Neo2's advanced return to home also reflects this philosophy. It works in a similar way to Mini 4 Pro, but with clear limitations. Neo2 always returns directly above the home point and then descends vertically. There's no cruise level return and no GNSS-less return capability. The home point itself is only updated once GNSS positioning becomes stable after takeoff. If you take off and immediately move laterally, the home point may update later than you expect. Follow modes show a similar balance between capability and caution. When using the remote controller, Neo2 supports dual ring follow logic. Obstacle avoidance in follow mode is conservative, sometimes overly so, and occasionally it can still fail completely. Once again, the protective cage prevents these moments from becoming serious problems. Compared to drones like Mini 5 Pro, Neo2's strategy is clearly more conservative when choosing follow directions. It tends to wait for more open space before attempting directional changes, rather than constantly probing for a preferred follow angle. In practice, this makes follow behavior feel a bit less dynamic, but also more predictable. When it comes to obstacle avoidance modes, this is one of the rare cases where aggressive mode actually makes more sense than standard. False positives can happen in both modes, and the difference in safety margin isn't dramatic. Maximum effective precision sits around 3 meters per second, slightly slower than drones using true binocular vision. But within those limits, Neo2 feels playful, durable, and surprisingly forgiving. So in the end, Neo2 doesn't introduce many genuinely new intelligent features. What it introduces is a new kind of compromise, a lightweight IMU-assisted LiDAR patched version of omnidirectional obstacle avoidance that looks complete on paper, but behaves very differently once you understand how it works. The displacement-based vision system is genuinely clever, but that cleverness comes at the cost of perception reliability. Still, having some level of full direction avoidance is better than having none at all. And building these systems remains a major technical barrier that many manufacturers still can't cross. So the final reminder is a simple one. No matter how advanced obstacle avoidance becomes, whether it's single camera, dual camera, LiDAR based, or low light optimized, it's always assistance, not insurance. The pilot's judgment is still the only safety system that never fails. Alright, this is it for today. If you have watched this video till the end, it shows how drone enthusiast you are. Keep flying safe, and I will see you in the next one.